Well, Maryland prosecutors will not be charging any police officers in the shooting death of a man in Montgomery County. This happened back in March. The family attorney for Duncan Lemp says the state's attorney concluded that the police were justified in using deadly force. Detectives had a no-knock warrant to search Lemp's home from Potomac for guns. Police say there was a trap attached to the bedroom door designed to fire a shotgun. They say Lemp was armed with a rifle.
They're glorified revenue collectors in some places.
Yeah. How does that change? How does that get better? How do we flip that?
Well, I mean, anarchists, their solution is that, I saw Michael Malice actually talking about this the other day, and he was making some very good points. And he was saying that there's no accountability when it comes to the police, in that if they were a private institution, they would have accountability. Like if it was a private institution that was hired to take care of things, they would be able to say, hey, you've done a terrible job of enforcing crime. Look at all this crime. Like, what justifies your pay? You've done a terrible job of this. You've confiscated resources from people and not returned them. You owe them that. That was one of the things they were doing in the South. I forget.
Florida.
It was.
A few years ago, you dropped the equivalent of a nuclear bomb with a study that you published.
I thought this was going to be the easiest paper I'd ever written in my entire career. I was so biased against the police myself, frankly. So I thought, this is clear. I'm going to get some data. I'm going to show that police are discriminating. So what we did is we collected millions and millions of data points across the country. So we did that, and what we found was that there are large racial differences in lower level uses of force, putting hands on people, throwing them up against a car, etc. Someone sent me a note and said, oh, this, lower level uses of force don't matter because, I thought it was about black lives. This is, who cares if they get pushed up against a car? And I wrote back, could you give me your address? I'll come push you up against the car. See how you feel about it. We collected data on 18 cities on actual shootings. In any way we cut the data, there were no racial differences in shootings. People lost their minds. It is these 12 videos or so, or 15 that we've seen that are horrific, don't get me wrong, are just not what the data tell you. What we found in the data is that when an investigation is announced, the police pull back and then crime goes up. So what we estimate is that for the three awful shootings and lives that we lost, Michael Brown, Freddie Gray, and Laquan McDonald, where there were investigations, those investigations caused 1,000 additional lives lost.
Welcome to the Libertarian Institute Odyssey and YouTube channel. Today I am joined by Matthew Gilman, the author of A Crash in the Night, The Assassination of Duncan Lemp. Mr. Gilman, thank you so much for your time. Where is the best place for people to find and purchase this book?
Unfortunately, Amazon. It's in digital format and paperback, depending on what you prefer. It's also currently in the KDP Select program, but I've been taking most of my stuff off of that recently after realizing a few things about the program. So, but it will be available in those two formats for the foreseeable future.
Sounds good. The links to A Crash in the Night are in the description below. What sources did you use to develop a general idea of what happened in the Duncan Lemp case?
The sources would have been several interviews with there was Casey Anthony. Oh my God. Wow. I'm already really screwing this one up. With Casey Robinson, Duncan Lemp's girlfriend. She was on the No Way Jose podcast. That was during my research process. There was there was her interview. There was the several police reports and news releases that they had done for the shooting afterwards, which all of them had completely different stories. So that was just looking into it initially before I even had the idea of doing a book. Just the fact that the police kept changing their story drastically every time they talked about it, got me more curious as to what really happened. There was the video footage that was released after a lawsuit that was made available, but not of the shooting. It was the aftermath and the layout of the house where everybody was at. This was almost immediately after Duncan was shot, and they said that he was deceased on the scene. So aside from people moving a few things here and there before the cameras were turned on, you had a good idea as to where things were, where things took place. And then there was the final report that the police released December 31st of 2020, where they came up with their final version. But it also had a grand jury testimony from Duncan's girlfriend in that, which also did not coincide with the interview that she gave later on. So there was a lot of, I hate to say it, misinformation to go through. But there was the physical evidence. There were statements made by a couple different witnesses that lined up and coincided. And from that, I was able to really piece together what was fact, what was fiction, and go from there.
Can you give me an example of a contradiction between two of the police reports?
Oh, yeah. So the first account was very vague. It was just that he had been shot during a raid, a SWAT raid in the middle of the night, after he had confronted police officers, and they didn't really explain what that was. The second one, which was very different, was stating that the SWAT team was in the room at the time of the shooting, that they had gone through the front door into the bedroom. They found Duncan standing there with the rifle, and then they shot and killed him during the raid. Then later on, in the final report, it was stated that the officer who was at Duncan's window, there's two officers there. One broke the window, and it was a crash and sweep where they use like a hook to pull the blinds aside, and then the second officer has a clear line of sight. And they stated that he was the shooting officer and that the other SWAT team members couldn't get into the room after Duncan was shot because his body was against the doors. So that completely disregarded anything that they had said prior to that final report. And that final report was 9 months later after the initial shooting. So they completely disregarded everything that they had reported to the press beforehand. They wrote this final version that was supposed to be the end all say all of like what had happened that night. And there's still a lot of loopholes, and there's a lot of excuses in there, but all the excuses for the raid are really just, there was nothing illegal that justified the shooting. They just tried to make him sound like, in their eyes, a bad guy. And that's no excuse to go into somebody's house at 4:30 in the morning and shoot someone.
And what was the date of this event?
This was March 12th of 2020, and it was around 4:30 in the morning. The time varies depending on the report. And this was just before all the lockdowns. This was around the same time as Breonna Taylor. So you ended up having protesters going, they're with Duncan Lemp, and they're in the Breonna Taylor BLM protests, and they were all intertwined. And but then, Breonna Taylor's story kind of continued, and for whatever reason, people kind of, I'm told that, people still care, and they still talk about the Duncan Lemp story, but if there's one that's still in the media, it's unfortunately not Duncan's story.
I noticed that the Breonna Taylor the killing was on March 13th, 2020. It's amazing. These are 1 day apart, very similar cases, except in the Duncan Lemp case. But was there any claim that Duncan or Casey were shooting at the officers?
The only time it was mentioned that Duncan had possibly shot at the officers came from his girlfriend, and that was in the grand jury testimony. And I really don't know if I trust what was revealed with that, because the grand juries are supposed to be sealed. And they won't release Duncan's juvenile records because those are supposed to be sealed. But for some reason, in that final report, they released testimony that was given during the grand jury, even though they're not supposed to. But they won't release Duncan. It's like they'll release whatever it is convenient for them. But at the same time, nobody was supposed to hear that except for the grand jury. And she had testified that he had picked up the rifle, aimed it at the officers, shot a couple rounds. They fired back, but then the police themselves said that there was no evidence that he had ever fired the rifle. There wasn't any bullet holes in the window frame or the walls. There were no shell casings on the floor of the bedroom. And the magazine was still full. Allegedly, the magazine on the rifle had fallen out when they removed it from Duncan, which there's question as to whether or not that ever happened too. But anyways, yeah. The closest I found was the shooting officer saying that Duncan had grabbed the rifle, raised it towards him, and that's when they shot him. But yeah, that's questionable as well.
Just the media blackout on this issue, on the Tony Timpa issue, on the Kelly Thomas issue. It's just amazing. It's too sad that the media is so racist that they really only care when there's a racial difference between the officer and the victim. Can we just make it about peaceful people and violent people instead? That's why I'm so thankful that you wrote this book. The title is A Crash in the Night, The Assassination of Duncan Lemp. If you had to bet money, what do you think happened that night? What is the most accurate portrayal of the likelihood of events?
You'd have to back up a little bit. There was a guy that had visited the house the evening before. This was in Duncan's girlfriend's interview where she was talking about this guy that he knew. He was at the house, was in her eyes acting kind of sketchy. He was there for a little bit, then he left, but then he came back unannounced, said that he left his phone charger at the house. And after that second time, they noticed that after he had left, the security cameras around the house had been moved. There were a couple of other things that they noticed that had been tampered with. They didn't think anything more of it after that. They just thought that the guy was messing with them. But it's not uncommon for SWAT teams to send an informant into a house to get a layout, an idea as to, what their plans might be for the night, where people sleep, where the weapons are kept, things of this nature. The other reason I believe this guy was an informant is because they did not use the direct access to the bedroom, which was a door that went from the bedroom straight outside. This bedroom used to be the garage of the house. It was converted into another room. So you had this access point where if you wanted to secure this guy and anything he might have, you're within a few feet of him once you kick in that door. But there was a booby trap on the door that they otherwise would not have known about unless somebody had told them.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So that was why they broke the window. They decided to go into the front door of the house. After the shooting, they secured the booby trap. They cut the wire to it. So everything was fairly well planned out before they had even entered the house. And for them to have that kind of information means that somebody was there prior. And the sooner they can have somebody in that house to the time that they do the raid, the more accurate that information is going to be.
Mm-hmm. And how did this guy come to their house in the first place? Was he going door to door?
No, she said that she asked Duncan about it, and apparently this guy had some concert tickets that he was interested in buying.
Oh, okay.
And that was how he ended up at the house. And he was doing a whole lot of other things. Like he had this fake, I believe he had a fake grenade that he was tinkering around with, and he was bragging about putting bumper stickers on police cars, and really trying to get at least Duncan to interact with the whole anti-cop sentiment, and it just wasn't working. It was irritating her. He ended up leaving. Her and Duncan had a conversation about the guy afterwards, and Duncan told her that, you know, he thought that maybe some cops did something bad to the guy's dad or something like that, but, you know, the guy just doesn't like cops. So
when it comes to lessons or what you learned about the militia movement in general, you have a chapter in this book, A Crash in the Night, The Assassination of Duncan Lemp, where you give a brief history of the militia movement in America. So before we get into, you know, what the police motive was for going into Duncan's house and having that raid, what do we need to know about the history of militias in America specifically?
Well, prior to, oh man, let's see here. Back in the 70s and 80s, the militia movement was really anti-government. They were involved in things like bank robberies, purchasing of illegal firearms. They had this idea in their philosophy of this war against the government that was coming. And it was also a very, you know, when they talk about white supremacy now, that was the idea back then. It was a very white supremacist movement. They believed it was a Christian nation, it was a white nation. They're going to bring it back to all of that. And what killed that ended up being the Oklahoma City bombing. The militias were getting more traction after Ruby Ridge, after Waco. People were kind of coming along to their ideas like, you know, maybe there is something wrong with the government here. And then Oklahoma City happened, and they really tried to tie Timothy McVeigh to the militia movement. And yeah, when you read about McVeigh, he did have those ideas, but at the same time, because of what he wanted to do, they wanted nothing to do with him. They're like, no, you're crazy. We're not doing that. And so, although depending on who you talk to, he may have had some help from militias, but he was never officially a member of any. And then after that, the militia movement kind of died down. 9/11 happened. It became very patriotic, focusing on protecting the homeland from foreign actors who would try to harm the United States. And then 2008, 2009, with the stock market crash, the financial crisis that happened, the new president that a lot of people were kind of questioning, like, who is this guy with all these kooky ideas? And next thing you know, you had the Three Percenters, the Boogaloo movement. I wouldn't really say that the Proud Boys were part of that, but it started around the same time. I don't think it was really instigated because of things of that nature. As far as I can tell, it was really just started as a joke. And, but then you definitely had this change in philosophy. And a lot of these groups looked at the previous events that had happened, and they tried to, unlike some other alphabet organizations we can think of, they actually tried to change what went wrong prior and make corrections to those things. So now it's, you know, they want to keep the moral high ground. They want to be more decentralized. They definitely, I think overall, even groups like the Oath Keepers, I think they really do have a good intention on what they're doing. None of these groups want to start a civil war. They will plan for one, you know, but they all openly say that they're not going to start it. They're just looking to react when it does finally happen. And yeah, I think that's the big difference there. I don't, in everything I looked into, I didn't see anything white supremacist anywhere. And even the FBI themselves have recently come out and said, we're supposed to be out looking for these people. We've got more people looking for them than we can find. So
yeah, the demand currently absolutely out exceeds the supply, and then even people Boogaloo boys like Magnus Panvidya are very open with the LGBTQ community, friends with Black Lives Matter, and support of Breonna Taylor. They have to pin this into a white supremacy thing. This way, we could ignore the fact that it's government supremacy that is actually going on. It's that they give the orders and we have to obey, or they will kill you. One thing about Oklahoma City, did you ever read the letter that the New York Times published from Timothy McVeigh?
Oh, no, I never. I did read the one he wrote to Jesse Trenadu. I don't know if, but I don't recall.
So let me read just a couple excerpts from this. So here is excerpts from Timothy McVeigh's letter published in the New York Times, 1998. Now, here's what led to my current life. It all revolves around my arrival at Fort Bragg for Special Forces. We all took intelligence, psychological adeptness, and a whole battery of other tests. Out of a group of 400, one-day information in formation, 10 social security numbers were called out, no names, and told to leave formation. Mine was one. The 10 of us were told that out of the select group of 400, we had scored the highest on certain tests. We had been selected because of our intelligence, physical makeup, and physical abilities. We were to feel special, part of a handpicked group. We were also asked to volunteer, talk about peer pressure, to do some work for the government on domestic as well as international front. What I learned next, both from briefings and from questions and private talks included, we would be helping the CIA fly drugs into the United States to fund many covert operations, yada, yada, yada. The point is that they took a guy trained by the government to kill people, and then when he killed people, they pinned it on the freedom movement. It is one of the greatest psychological warfare scams maybe ever. Even if he did it under the guise of, well, now I'm part of the militia movement because of Waco, now I'm totally changed. They trained this guy to kill people, and then he kills people, and then they pin it on the freedom movement. It's almost as bad as the Federal Reserve causing a recession and then blaming the voluntary sector. But this is just the worst. Anything more on Waco, Oklahoma City, the militia movement before we get into the other details?
Is that the letter that he had written to his sister?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I was familiar with that. But I'm trying to remember the other guy that was basically his handler.
Andre Straussmeyer?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's another one that should be a huge red flag.
It was exactly who came to mind while I was reading A Crash in the Night when you mentioned the guy who was hanging around Duncan's house selling him the concert tickets. I go, yep, that certainly sounds like one of them. That was just a red flag. Speaking of red flags, was this a red flag law operation? Is that what their motive was?
They try to link it to that. Even the police, throughout the 9 months of them releasing the press releases and the final report, initially they stated it was because they were informed by a confidential source, not an anonymous tip. Somebody had contacted the sheriff's department stating that he was in possession of a firearm that is illegal in the state of Maryland, which it turned out later it wasn't. That he had made inflammatory comments about the police online, that he was on mymilitia.com trying to find other 3%ers to train with. There was a whole series of information that had been given to the sheriff's department from somebody who's able to spend a lot of time and money going through different websites and his accounts to gather all of this. And then the sheriff's department started their own investigation. And this all happened around the same time that he had made a post on Instagram showing his computer, a series of code on the screen, a pistol on the side. And somebody had asked him in the comment section what he was working on. And he, through code, stated as to what the project was. And that was around the same time that all this information had been given to the sheriff's department. So they used the gun, the rifle, as the excuse to do the raid. A judge signed off on doing a no-knock raid because of the comments about police, about how they knew that he owned a bulletproof vest, his training with firearms, which, again, none of this stuff is illegal.
Mm-hmm.
The fact that he purchased a firearm in the state of Maryland through a legal licensed gun dealer. And what they did was they took a photograph of him with the rifle. They sent the photograph. We don't know like what angle of the rifle this was, what it showed. We have no idea how clear it was. They just sent that to the manufacturer and said, hey, does this happen to be your illegal version of this firearm that this guy is holding? And they're like, yeah, it looks like one of ours. And they just use that to say that he was in possession of a firearm that he shouldn't have. They also tried to say that he had a felony as a minor, which nobody can confirm whether or not he does have one. He does have a criminal record as a minor, but he never went to juvie. As far as anyone can tell, he did whatever it is that he needed to do in order to continue on. He purchased several firearms legally with background checks, cleared the background checks. So there is no indication whatsoever that he wasn't allowed to own these. And then they tried to say that him 3D printing certain parts of firearms was illegal because of his past. Otherwise, it would have been legal. But then again, he would have had no way to know because no one had ever told him, yeah, FBI database says you can't own this firearm. We can't sell it to you. Sorry. Instead, it was, do you have cash? Cool. Here you go.
Yeah. So when it comes to any punishments for the officers involved, anything happened to the officers who invaded the house of a guy who was being totally peaceful and murdered him?
We don't know who the shooting officer was. They never released that information. There was no disciplinary action taken. We don't know who the other officers in the raid were. It was mentioned in the report that there was a 2016 raid on the same house, and it was unknown if any of the officers in that raid were involved in this one. It's weird how they just don't keep track of anything like that. Yeah, so we don't know who any of the people involved in the raid were. We don't know who the shooting officer was. There was no disciplinary action whatsoever. That was part of the grand jury to decide whether or not the officer was going to be held liable for shooting Duncan. And it was declared I hate to call it a clean kill, but it was basically a legal shooting during the raid for him. So there's no disciplinary action. Yeah, there's like no repercussions whatsoever. And there's 2 lawsuits right now between Duncan's family and his girlfriend and son, which they have to have their own separate lawsuit because they weren't married. According to the state of Maryland, technically she doesn't have a claim for unlawful death because they weren't, even though they had a kid together, they were living together. She happened to be in the same house, injured during the same raid, pregnant at the time of the raid, was held in custody and interrogated after, but technically she doesn't have any legal recourse for a lawsuit for Duncan being dead. She said that it was going to be another 5 or 6 years before that would even come to a conclusion.
When it comes to anything else that we need to know about the book, we talked about their potential motives. We talked about the militia movement, gave us a good idea of what most likely happened and the sources you used. Anything else people need to know? But anything else that people need to know about this situation?
Yeah. I think the biggest lesson here, and keep in mind, I'm saying this as like, I don't believe Duncan did anything wrong. Like, we should have our First Amendment, we should have free speech, uh, we should have the ability to speak our philosophies and our ideas without repercussions like this. But at the same time, when you have departments like Homeland Security and the FBI monitoring everything that is on the internet and creating files on people that stay permanent, almost like a Stasi, uh, you really have to watch what you say and who you say it to online. And this is even instant messenger on Facebook, because now we know that Facebook was handing over messages to the FBI after the 2020 election, saying, hey, these people don't believe that the election is legit. Are they terrorists? And that was up to the FBI to decide. So with all of this stuff going on, it's like, I hate to say, your best bet, if you want to have a conversation with somebody and you're afraid that what you're saying might land you in trouble later, somewhere along the line, mail a letter. It's like, it's really the only way to bypass. Like, they're just grabbing everything. And if you just say one thing out of line, it could be your house at 4 o'clock in the morning that all of a sudden is being raided and you have no idea what the heck is going on, and they'll come up with every excuse in the book afterwards to cover their own butts, and you're still dead.
Excellent work. The book is A Crash in the Night, A Crash in the Night, The Assassination of Duncan Lemp. Find it in Amazon in the link in the description. Mr. Gilman, thanks so much for your time, sir.
Thank you.